wasn't in town in the last month, so it's lower, but not sure. Like, just haven't been around. Well, good evening. My name's Doug Beckett, and I'm one of the facilitators of the Energy Transition Group at the University of Northern British Columbia. And tonight we have guest presenter Chris Peter. Chris Peter is an engineer, and he's got a little bit of a challenge to him because Chris, his brother is also an engineer and presented in December. Told us, gave us some insight on China with their 380 kilowatt charging on average and greater for cars and charging stations. Lots of exciting information, including the General Motors vehicle built in China that seats 4 people, has over 200 kilometers range for $4,104 Canadian. Anyways, Chris,
text something in the chat box we want to see it. So just say
they're in discussion on the side or something.
Yeah, just if somebody has a question, just
absolutely.
Yeah. So Chris, I'll turn it over to you, and we're going to get some insight on the energy transition and efficiency in very remote communities throughout Canada. Looking forward to the presentation. Thank you, Chris.
Yes, that's great. Thank you very much. Good evening. My name is Chris Peter, and I've been a professional engineer involved in the design of building mechanical systems for most of my working life. The purpose of this talk is to try to give some insight into how Canadians' relationship with energy use in remote communities has evolved over the past 50 years or so. Now, a little background material. I was originally going to give this entirely on buildings that we have visited in communities in British Columbia over the last 10 years or so with Radloff Engineering. But it turns out that in the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act of BC, there is a Section 18, which forbids you from releasing any information about First Nations without their written consent. So I said, okay, well, we'll do it on all the remote communities that I've worked in that are outside of BC. So that's why the rather random, scattered nature of the places. But it's like doing a quality control assay in time of then 35 years ago and now as to how the uptake of renewable energy is taking place in remote communities. So slide 1, the key map. We will start with Frobisher Bay, which is now Iqaluit. After its emergence as a military airfield during the Second World War, Frobisher Bay underwent some quite bizarre planning exercises. Okay, there we go. This, if you can believe it or not, was John Diefenbaker's government's vision for a community of 4,000 people with stores, a hotel, banks, and a movie theater, all under a central dome in the middle of the community. And residential towers radiating out like the spokes of a wheel, all heated by a nuclear reactor that you would be living with in this complex. And needless to say, when you look at the actual physical reality, the surface area to volume ratio of this is outrageous for an Arctic community because the heat loss is going to be so great from all the residential towers. And moreover, you simply could not build those buildings on permafrost. So the vision that was embraced initially was kind of dumbed down into a more realistic thing, which is the creation of the Astro Hill complex, which Doug has actually been in. And I lived there for 2 years as a project engineer up there. And it's an interesting concept because it's a central core of buildings. These two buildings, this is an 8-story apartment building. This is a 6-story apartment building. These are stores, a bank, a swimming pool, a hotel, and this is your workplace. This is the W.G. Brown building where all the government work in Nunavut took place years ago. In the distance, you see the ubiquitous tank farm because the entire city was dependent on oil, diesel fuel, as its energy source. And instead of a nuclear reactor, the plant heating the complex was located almost a kilometer away at the top of the hill. And it generated high temperature, that's 300-degree Fahrenheit water, which had to be kept under a confining pressure to prevent it from flashing to steam. The pipes that came down the hill for the kilometer, there was a supply and a return and a backup supply and return. These were insulated pipes in a utilidor initially. Eventually, the utilidor blew off in the 140-kilometer-per-hour blizzards, and the Inuit would run their skidoos over the pipe until the insulation was gone. And you could hear the snowflakes hissing as they hit the 300-degree pipe. In 1986, the estimated cost of the heat loss from the utilidor containing the supply and return piping from the power plant, this in 1986 dollars, was $900,000 per year. So this could be improved upon as a heating source, right? So in 1990, when I say we, anything that relates to the early period, the 1990s, is A.D. Williams Engineering, now Williams Engineering out of Edmonton. Anything that I say we in the present day, in the 2020s, is Radloff Engineering from Prince George. So in 1990, we, Williams Engineering, had an opportunity to rectify this situation by replacing the Northern Canada Power Commission plant with a low temperature, low pressure heating plant set inside the complex. Now, this is very poor because it's a Dead Sea Scroll. It's a 35-year-old blueprint. But you were looking at that from the other side over here. And this power plant now was set right in the middle between two of the buildings. And it allowed for supply and return water to go in both directions, be pumped in both directions to the old heat exchanger stations that were located all along the buildings. And we had a stroke of luck because the original engineer from Montreal Engineering still was, he hadn't retired from Montreal Engineering. We phoned him up in Montreal. He was a Ukrainian called Jersey. And he said, just a minute, I'll get out my nomographs and I'll recalculate those heat exchanger operating points for something that's below the threshold of a high pressure, high temperature plant. So he recalculated everything for water temperature less than 150 degrees Fahrenheit and less than 150 PSI, which meant you no longer needed 3 shifts of stationary engineers to supervise the plant. You could just have an unsupervised low temperature plant. And you can actually see in the previous slide, you can see the stacks from that heating plant there. That basically heated the whole of the core of Frobisher Bay from 1990 onward. Yeah.
Question, just to put some of this into context, roughly how many people were living in this community at that time?
There were 4,000 people living in the community at the time. However, they were not all living in the centrally heated complex. There were lots of standalone housing units, and there was very varying housing. There was, entrepreneurs had built luxury housing on the fringes of town. There were shacks on the beach that had people living in. Housing has always been a problem in Iqaluit, and there were multiple families under one roof. But this was the original government planned core of the city that I'm talking about here. By setting the plant inside the center of the town and by lowering the temperature and pressure, not only did this increase the second law of thermodynamics heating efficiency of the plant, since the lower the temperature difference is, the higher the efficiency, but it matched the boiler output to the load. If you look up here, there's a table of heating requirements in the top right corner. You can't read them, but they total 14 million BTU per hour. And I excuse the imperial units, but for some reason, my industry has never properly converted to metric because it's based in the United States and they're behind the times. So you'll have to bear with it. So with the known load of the buildings at 14 million BTU, a boiler plant with an input of 17 million BTU was required, allowing it to meet the design load operating at 80% efficiency. This replaced a 56 million BTU per hour boiler in the power plant, which operating at high fire at 80% efficiency wasted 11 million BTU per hour up the chimney when it was operating on high fire. So, you know, that gives you cause to reflect on just how inefficient the original designers were. Energy wasn't an issue in the 60s. They never thought of the fact that you're wasting 11 million BTU per hour up the chimney. So that heating plant has now operated with minor modifications for 35 years and is still in use today. Also in 1990, we had the privilege of working on the design of the Unik Arvik Visitor Center, a super insulated building with vapor and air barrier installation meticulously detailed by the architect. The architect did this all at a scale of 1.5 inches to the foot to show exactly where the vapor barrier and the air barrier were to be installed in the building envelope. And that's like 1 to 12, these blueprints. I wish I still had them, but they're 1/12 size of reality. And he knew he could get away with that, Stephen Barr, because the Inuit have incredible manual dexterity as a result of living in their culture for 6,000 years. And you only employed Inuit workers to put the vapor barrier in. They had infinite patience and they would do it exactly the way the architect wanted it. So this was a building that was very, very tight. And the only air that got in was the measured amount of air that you brought in for ventilation. To size the boilers correctly, we modeled the building heating system on new software out of Wisconsin called F-Load, which was an interactive program that calculated monthly heating loads of buildings and their life cycle cost. The building ultimately became one of the main tourist attractions in Iqaluit. And this is a view inside of a diorama where you walk into a room and you're underwater with a beluga whale floating over your head. And you're looking up through the ice at the terrestrial wildlife above the ice and the aquatic marine life below the ice. It's quite arresting. The building is still in use today as a major attraction with diorama displays and a wealth of Inuit cultural information. However, I'm sorry to report that not all buildings constructed in the Arctic at this time were as energy conscious as this one. Architectural and Engineering Services of Transport Canada wanted to build a showpiece air terminal building at Norman Wells on the Mackenzie River, just below the Arctic Circle. Because of the spectacular view of the Mackenzie Mountains southwest across the river, the design brief called for a 2-story expanse of southwest facing glass. Now, this is at latitude 64 degrees. So the daylight is non-existent in the winter and it is pretty much continuous during the summer. And this created difficulties in modeling the building. First of all, my computer program, which was the Carrier Software Systems E20-2 program, went berserk because the sun wasn't setting. And It couldn't handle it. So we had to modify the program to make it work on this building. Given Norman Wells's 1% winter design temperature of minus 45 degrees Celsius, this required the installation of 2 tiers of high output radiators, one at the midpoint of the glass and one at the bottom of the glass, convecting heat up the inside face of the windows. Not only was there extreme winter heat loss from the building, but the long summer hours of daylight and the 28 degrees Celsius summer design temperature, yes, that's the same as Prince George. Norman Wells has the same summer design temperature as Prince George. Peaked in July with a 46-ton, 552,000 BTU per hour mechanical cooling load that vanished during the remainder of the year when the building could be cooled with outdoor air. So an air conditioning system was installed that operated only a few times per year. Remember, this is before the days of non-ozone depleting and non-global warming refrigerants. So we were using R22, an ozone depleting and global warming substance, in a community with no refrigeration mechanics to service it. So this was not an optimal design for the place. This is not appropriate technology, in my opinion. And we made a representation to Transport Canada where we modeled the energy costs of the building. And in 1990, we said, this is going to cost you $12,600 a year in utility bills. And they didn't bat an eyelid. They just said, oh, fine. Now, today, that would be a reasonable amount to pay for electricity. And in this case, strangely enough, propane, because Norman Wells has its own propane plant that it makes out of the natural gas in the ground that comes up from the ground there. Remember, this was the source of the fuel that was used to build the Alaska Highway. And the Canal pipeline used to carry it down to Whitehorse. And they had a refinery down there. Anyway, over the objections of the design engineers, this building was built and is still in operation. But I can't say that it is either appropriate or energy efficient. But it won an award. So the architect won an award. So who are we? We're just engineers. So this was a snapshot of heating infrastructure in the Northwest Territories and what is now Nunavut 35 years ago. As you can see, there was very limited use of solar panels. We didn't even think of them. Wind turbines and almost no geo-exchange systems due to the presence of permafrost. The heavy hand of government, both federal and territorial, tended to put a damper on innovation and certainly discouraged the Inuit, Dene, and Inuvialuit population from any bold new initiatives. Inspecting buildings now in Northern Ontario, let's move to the present, 30 years later, then you see that more renewable energy systems have been incorporated into buildings, but they still retain a heavy dependence on diesel fuel trucked in over winter roads, particularly where they are not grid connected. So here is Inchoque Birch Stick School, constructed in Pikangikum, which is the largest Ojibwe community in Northern Ontario, population of about 6,000. It was constructed in 2016 at a cost of $58.7 million. And that's a lot of money to pay, but it's it is a school that has absolutely everything that you would expect of a school. The original design was entirely dependent on fuel oil, both for the generation of its electricity and for heating the building. And these are the diesel generators that provided the electricity, and these are the fuel tanks. You notice that this tank here is number 4 of the 4 diesel tanks that were installed when it was built in 2016. When we inspected the building in 2022, the meter on generator number 3, which is this one here, had clocked 10,600 hours since 2016. Now, it hadn't even been turned on except to test it since 2016. And the reason for that is that the Pekanjikam power line was completed in December 2018 as part of the Wate Nikane Yap power transmission line, an 1,800 kilometer, 28 billion First Nation owned project, which is extending the Ontario electricity grid to 17 remote communities. Just to put you in perspective here, here is Pekanjikam here. The Manitoba border is over here. James Bay is up here. And the other communities that I'm going to talk about, Muskrat Dam is here. And what you notice if you look at the fine print here is that that line from Red Lake to Pekanjikam is shown as being an existing power transmission line. So it is in place right now. These lines here are still under construction. And when we were there, Vallard Construction out of Quebec, Vallard Engineering out of Quebec they had camps everywhere. There were right-of-ways being cleared. There were power poles being put up. There was wire being strung. It was all systems go to build this project in 3 phases. It was very impressive. But completion of the Pekanjikam power line in December 18 enabled these generators to be shut down and remain available as standby generators only. Now, it's easy to underestimate the transformative effect that this transmission project is having on the remote communities of Northern Ontario. In the case of the beautiful OG Cree community of Muskrat Dam here, the hockey arena was designed to be heated electrically with a 225 amp, 240 volt panel serving an electric boiler system. But the design engineers neglected to notice that there was an aging and overloaded diesel generator operating in that community. And this overloaded the system. But the design engineers did include a wood standby boiler. Backup wood-fired boiler, however, could not be maintained 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And the building, plumbing, and glycol heating systems had to be shut off and drained, leaving the arena to be used only as an unheated workshop, which is kind of a waste of infrastructure. However, the power line is approaching Muskrat Dam as we speak. So this arena will be able to be, connection of this building to the power grid will enable the arena to reopen. So when you build a new power line, it has some unanticipated side effects. Getting back to Pekanjikam School, an interesting side effect of grid connection appears to be that the SMA solar photovoltaic system. I don't know if any of you know of SMA. I had never heard of them before, but these inverters were on the roof, and these solar panels were on the roof, all ballasted down with sandbags, which seemed a little strange, but they were only a temporary energy source that had been put in until the power line made it there. These were shut off when we were there. They weren't connected. It seems to me that the transfer switch that had been used for feeding them into the school system was now used for the backup diesel oil generators, and that they were being fed from the grid as their primary energy source. So these had been set up as a short-term alternate energy solution, and it's no longer needed. So they're just sitting there. The effort expended by the 24 First Nations who are part of the Wate Power Transmission Project to change the ownership structure of power distribution leading up to the creation of this power distribution line has been quite a story. And the Narwhal, the publication of the Narwhal, reports that over the last 10 years, Wate Power has challenged the core of how energy projects are built in Ontario. They are now community-led and owned, and can be a blueprint for how energy infrastructure is to be approached in the future. To illustrate how connection to the electricity grid allows communities to shed their dependence on fossil fuels for heating their buildings. Let us now examine some of the infrastructure in the 3 communities that make up Lac Seul, which is a First Nation northwest of Sioux Lookout that has been connected to the grid for many years. This is Obishikokang School in Frenchman's Head. And it is served for heating and ventilating and cooling the school by an all-electric air handling unit, which heats and ventilates the entire school in conjunction with a couple of heat recovery ventilators. It's hard to know what this is doing, but the airflow is from right to left. So in comes the return air through here. It is diverted by a set of dampers that are sitting in here, and a certain amount of it is exhausted up through this duct. Then these dampers also determine how much air is going to be introduced from the outside air here. Comes through, runs through a bank of filters here, and then goes through 3 big electric heating elements, which heat it to the required temperature for whatever the school is calling for. And then it is distributed by a supply fan up this supply duct here. And in the summertime, what you can do is open these dampers full and bring in 100% outside air and turn off the electric elements and cool the school with the outside air. Because this is, of course, Northern Ontario, where it's generally cool enough to cool the school with free cooling. Here is Wananita Wangang Memorial School in Kedjik Bay, which is an older school built in 1999. And it has an elaborate primary glycol to glycol, primary geothermal heat pump, and secondary heat pump here, which is glycol to air. So what this thing is doing is it's extracting heat from a ground loop here. It's putting it into a building loop here, which is, both of them are glycol for freeze protection. Then that building loop runs up here into the glycol to air heat exchanger, which has a blower in it and blows air through, warming it in the winter and cooling it in the summer. And although these are aging and use refrigerant R22, and a lot of them were on their last legs when we were there, it's a well-designed system, and it uses only electricity as the energy source. And it's extremely efficient because of the thermodynamics of ground source heat transfer. I'd like to take you now to Manitoulin Island, or Minidu-Minising in Lake Huron, which is the world's largest freshwater island, where renewable energy systems and cultural pride seem to go hand in hand with one another. This is the Ojibwe Cultural Foundation in Imchiging. And you see these cruise ships there. And I've never seen this in my life before, but European tourists disembark and they go straight to the Ojibwe Cultural Foundation to view the Ojibwe culture. They're not remotely interested in North American culture. They're here for the indigenous tourism. And this is a new phenomenon in Canada, and it's a very, very well-respected place where international tourists disembark from cruise ships to soak up Anishinaabeg culture. When we arrived in Imchiging administration office, we were greeted with steaming cups of hot coffee in the parking lot by the chief, a young woman who is registered as a certified engineering technologist in Ontario. And this is her office, the administration office in Imchiging. The building was in immaculate condition. It was equipped with rooftop solar panels and heat recovery ventilators, although it was still heated with oil furnaces. The Imchiging Arena and Community Center, however, was heated with ground source heat pumps. So here you have the ground loop coming in at the top, There is a compressor in there that transfers it into a coil, which has air blown past it, and it blows conditioned air, once again, cool in the summer, cold, warm in the winter, through the building. And it's entirely sourced from a ground geothermal loop in the parking lot. It also has a large flat roof, well occupied by solar panels. This is only the beginning. On the exposed heights above Imchiging, there are 2 permanent wind turbines, 100% owned and operated by the First Nation, and known as the Mother Earth Renewable Energy Project, or MERE. Now, Mother Earth Renewable Energy is a result partly of a law that was introduced in Ontario in 2009, which introduced a feed-in tariff, which is kind of would be the envy of people like Doug, which offered a fixed energy price for owners of wind turbine for 20 years. And this wasn't Kathleen Wynne. This predated Kathleen Wynne by about 4 years. The capital cost for this project, the 2 turbines, was $13 million, but it produces about 8.5 million kilowatt hours annually. And this is what Imchiging's 400 homes would consume if they all converted to electric heat from propane, oil, and wood. So here's the monthly energy production. And you know what this tells me? It tells me that these turbines have been well selected, because if you extended this curve upward, that would show what the turbines would generate if they did not have a governor that prevented them from turning past a certain RPM when the wind is high in the winter. But by selecting the turbines in this range, it means that the summer production is quite high as well. If you put a smaller turbine in that peaked here, you would have almost no electricity production in the summer, although you wouldn't need a governor on the blades. So this spreads out. By selecting the wind turbine at the right size, you actually manage to even out the electricity production over the full year. Now it gets better. At the east end of Manitoulin Island is the peninsula of Wikwemikong, which is a First Nation that, interestingly enough, refused to join Canada when the rest of Manitoulin Island signed a treaty with Canada in 1862. And I don't know if it was just a coincidence, but this is where we encountered the greatest number of buildings with renewable energy systems. This is Wasiabans High School, which was built in 1999, designed by a 100% Indigenous-owned architectural firm and equipped with a brand new pellet boiler plant, which was put in recently. This is the hopper for the pellet boilers, and these are the pellet boilers. They're actually in a shipping container located beside the school. The gymnasium roof of Wasiaban School is angled towards the southern sun. And this tells you how far south the latitude of Manitoulin Island is. Even though it's in northern Ontario, we would never put solar panels at that angle here, would we, Doug? But, you know, it's because the optimal angle is quite a lot higher in the sky than it is at our latitude. So this allowed the installation of an 87 kilowatt solar photovoltaic array with wall-mounted inverters. To enable the high school to be designated as a post-disaster building, it's also retained its old oil boilers, but they're not turned on. They're just a backup. And there's a recently installed 1600 amp 3-phase emergency generator, which is mounted on top of its fuel tank, but it's strictly a backup. The building services systems are controlled by a sophisticated direct digital control system. And if you look here, these are those 3 boilers we saw earlier. These are the primary pumps here, which circulate the high temperature water from the boilers. And this is what we call a magic H, which is an exchange loop with a three-way valve that allows you to schedule the secondary water through the secondary pumps here by opening or closing, modulating this three-way valve here. So in the summertime, you can have low temperature water in here, and in the wintertime, you can have high temperature water. Now, there's a shadow on it, but this is actually the schedule. There's a line going here, and this is the outside temperature, and this is the boiler water temperature here. So it follows automatically this scheduling, depending on the outside air temperature, as to what the secondary water is going to be run at. And this is the one of the controllers that control these systems. There's about 10 of them in the building. The building services system allows scheduled operating and real-time monitoring of the heating, ventilating, and air conditioning or HVAC equipment. And it allows trend logging for diagnosing problems. This was the high school, but the elementary schools in Wikwemikong, although not as sophisticated, also had solar arrays and heat recovery ventilators. Now, even in remote parts of the Wikwemikong Peninsula, we found renewable energy systems in operation. This is the Spanish Hill Community Center, which is a remote log building in South Bay, which historically, South Bay was the home of the Odawas, who federated with other Ojibwe groups to, well, they're actually not Ojibwe, to form Wikwemikong way back when the community sort of basically declared its independence from Canada. And the Odawas are the ethnic group from which Canada's capital city derives its name. And the manager of this building, Herman, was the chief of the Odawas. And just to give you some insight into how they operate, they were known for their farming expertise in the old days. And he used to drive loads of steel. Him and his wife would drive loads of steel from Hamilton to San Francisco in 4 days. That was what he did for a living. And he doesn't consider himself a citizen of any country except he's the chief of South Bay. So he's crosses freely into the US, crosses freely into Canada. But here in South Bay, he's installed the most beautiful little geothermal system I've ever seen in my life, which is this geologics unit that takes the supply and return pumps that pump fluid through a geothermal field outside the building. This geologics unit, using a compressor, puts the heat into the air. You can't see it, but there's ductwork and a filter up top here. And at the same time, through a second circuit, it preheats the domestic hot water for the building, all off one single geothermal unit. And this is like a $4,000 unit. It's you could buy one for your house if you had a geothermal field outside the building. This is a log building that you would think of as a primitive building, and it has the most beautifully sophisticated system that I've ever seen. Anyway, enough of that. It not only heats the building by extracting heat from the ground loop, but it also preheats the domestic hot water through the building through a separate circuit. Now, we've covered a fair amount of ground, both geographical and technical, which illustrates that communities in remote parts of Canada are embracing renewable technology, at least as far as the building sector is concerned. I'd now like to close by giving you the most recent update on Iqaluit. On February the 4th, exactly 1 week ago, the Inuit-owned renewable energy developer, Nunavut Nukiksaaltiit Corporation, was granted $6 million by the Canadian Northern Development Economic Agency, earmarked for engineering and design work on a 15 to 30 megawatt hydro project northeast of Iqaluit on the Kuugalak River. I don't know if you can see what's going on here, but this would have been the Kuugalak River. The dam would be here. North is at the bottom of the page. And there's a spillway shown and a powerhouse down here. below a penstock. It's about a 50 high meter dam, and it has to be that high because the thickness of the freezing in the winter is such that you only have the water that's available below the ice. The project has the potential to become Iqaluit's main electricity source, and it uses technology that was used to create a hydropower project in Nuuk, the capital of Greenland. Although the exact capacity of such a plant has not yet been determined, with the engineering only now beginning, hopes are high that among the Inuit community, that the solution to the perennial problem of Iqaluit's dependency on diesel fuel may be finally achievable. Thank you. Now, I'm sure you have questions, so feel free to. Do we have time?
Oh, yeah, lots of
I have a question.
that way.
Yeah,
Can we check online first?
sure.
See if there's
Absolutely.
anything in the chat
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, I have a question to Doug here.
Okay.
With that hydro project you just closed with, I'm just curious, like, what's the implications of flooding a reservoir like that with permafrost?
That's an interesting question. They deliberately chose a site that is almost entirely on igneous rock, meaning that if you thaw the ground out, it's not going to landslide. It's not going to it's not going to saturate and have a slope stability failure. That was one of the considerations in picking the site. There were, I believe, 8 sites picked initially, and they were all carefully examined as to which was the optimal location. This one's located about 60 kilometers northeast of Iqaluit.
Okay,
And-
yeah, that makes total sense then. Okay. Thank you.
Remember, Baffin Island is a very, very old piece of the Canadian Shield. It's about 2.8 billion years old. So it's not going anywhere.
Not going anywhere soon anyway.
No, not soon, no. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Trish, was there anything else online? Anything in the chat? Okay, we'll check online again in a few minutes.
Yeah.
Questions from the in-person audience? Yeah.
Curious with this community to that proposed plan, but you said roughly 60.
It's roughly 60 kilometers. They had to go quite far afield. Yeah. It's, I used to ski outside Iqaluit, and it's just as barren as can be. And you come across a little snow shelf, and you'll find a pot of oil and 2 pistons. And somebody has rebuilt their skidoo engine there, in the middle of nowhere. It's unfathomable how those people survive.
I was just wondering if you could give a verbal update on what's going on in BC.
As far as sustainable energy is concerned, there are a number of initiatives that are being undertaken in remote communities. There's one community in north of us here that has installed a combined heat and power from biomass system to do some heating and generate some power in the town. But a lot of them tend to be prototypical. They're not always led by the community. They're more likely to be led by engineers or government associations. There's not as much initiative, it appears. Remember that the communities in BC are ethnically fragmented. There's not a large Ojibwe or a large Cree block of people who are culturally homogeneous. And I think that there's an advantage in being in parts of Canada where there is a strong common language and a strong common culture. The Inuit are very much on the same page about these things, and it's quite impressive to see. You can just see from the documentation how, how they've seized the initiative. You know, this is their own project. It's not being done by outside forces. I can't really talk specifically about communities in BC because Radloff has told me not to, just because of confidentiality.
I don't know if anyone can answer.
Start over.
Yeah, it's probably a bit of an echo from my hearing right now, but we'll see what I can do. But I do reflect on the north, and most people have never gone to any of these places, and it seems to be there's something about want to have a presence for being there. So I see these communities, and you know, so some of the centers are communities into their main centers in Galloway, and other places are not being built up. But still, there seems to be something about building a presence of Canada. This it's kind of a remarkable sort of thing that somehow.
It's a unique nation in that respect, in that, you know, we used to plant a priest and an RCMP officer and a nurse in these communities and call it Canada. And, you know, a lot of the communities just looked on in a bemused fashion while this colonial experiment was going on. And they waited for us to leave, and now they're asserting their independence. And I think that's the fact that either they have access to resources to do renewable energy, or else they're actually doing this off their own bat because they're closer to the rhythms of the planet and, you know, whatever philosophical slant you can put on it. But they seem to be much more open to using renewable energy systems. And in fact, really regard diesel fuel in particular as a odious thing that they want to get rid of. Okay, you're welcome. I didn't really answer you.
Getting rid of the diesel means that you're not reliant on an outside source. So to be
Yeah.
independent,
Yeah.
it becomes a local democracy with your energy. So
I think that this is public, but everyone knows that there was an oil barge that foundered off Bella Bella a number of years ago and created an oil slick. And the community of Bella Bella has been adamant that they're getting off oil ever since then. And they're doing it.
Can I ask another question?
Hydro plant at Ocean Falls.
They do now. Yes,
And
that's correct.
Goes
Yep.
back 30 years.
Yeah. They're fortunate in that they have a connection. Even Kitasoo has a hydro connection. Sorry, there was a question from.
Doug online, go ahead.
Yeah, not so much a question as well, I'll see if you agree with my little observation. It's a trivial point, but for some reason it's stuck in my head. Was when I guess on Manitoulin, when you were showing the graph of the production of the wind turbines, and you were saying how they had to have a big enough turbine basically to get much during the summer season. Well, I was looking at the graph and I was thinking there's still a distinct summer dip there. And I was thinking, wouldn't that be perfect for a combined solar and wind system where that summer gap would be filled in by solar, and then your dominant production would be by wind in the winter? Are they sort of doing that there?
Absolutely. That's you know, the two systems are perfectly able to be integrated for a seamless renewable energy. You don't need batteries for the solar system if you are making up for it in winter with the turbines. I may have got it wrong. That may not have been the exact reason for sizing the wind turbine that way. But it seems to me that most wind turbines, the optimal, when you read the literature on them, the optimal thing is to have them ramp up to a certain level and then just control them with a governor. Don't let them overspeed, because first of all, you'll wear the bearings out. Secondly, it's if you select them for that operation, then you can generate more during off-peak wind conditions.
Yeah, that kind of makes sense to me. Same like with the solar, you often need to size it sort of bigger than you would normally, just because you want to be able to when you have a bout of cloudy weather, you want to get enough.
Exactly, or snow on the photovoltaics, or
Yeah.
the sun angle in the wrong place.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
anybody else online? Doug, can you see if there's anything in the chat?
Hang on a sec here.
Feel free.
Just some compliments to the speaker. That's about it.
Okay.
Yeah, I could show here like one.
Okay,
I'm sorry once again to not concentrate on the local situation. There's some very interesting things happening in British Columbia, and if it wasn't for this law, I don't think the First Nations themselves object. I think it's more that the bureaucrats object. So since we are working directly for Radloff Engineering under contract to Indigenous Services Canada, then we're under confidentiality agreements. All the work we did in Eastern Canada was done under, I think they're called Brazo Engineering out of Fort Francis. And they're an Indigenous owned and operated engineering firm. And they said, go ahead, be our guest, spread the information around. So there seems to be a difference, a geographic difference in how information is allowed to be conveyed. Yeah.
Now, I didn't quite get when you were talking about the Indigenous community on, I think it was Manitoulin, that never became part of Canada.
Yes. Yeah.
And was it then that you were surprised to see how much renewable?
Well, it was them that had the most uptake of renewable energy of any community that we visited. And they initially, the treaty commissioners went around and said, oh, you'll get benefits and we'll pay you this. And the chiefs from Manitoulin Island just said, absolutely, categorically, no. We don't want to be part of this country. We want nothing to do with it. Go away. And the people who had convinced them to not join Canada were their Jesuit missionaries who said, it's going to be a bad thing. It's not going to work out for anyone. Stay on your own. And it seems to have worked for them. So who are we to say?
And so do you think that they've just come up with this on their own kind of thing, or they had just researched things?
I really have no idea. I do know that to build a school like Wassiabin takes millions and millions of dollars.
Right.
And they do say on their water tower, they do say Canada's only officially recognized unceded Indian reserve. And if they're smart, they're playing that card to get as much money as they can from the country that they're not part of.
Like, do you think that they developed the renewable stuff themselves? Like,
well, no, the technology is easily available. Remember
right.
that there's a ferry from South Bay over to Michigan that goes every few hours. So they're really part of a big industrial, Michigan is a big industrial
right. Yeah.
state, right?
Yeah. Cool.
Hi, Chris. My name is Dave. I've also worked in consulting and done some projects in the north. So I completely,
Hooray, good for
completely
you.
follow you 100% with what you've been saying. And I just wanted to comment a little bit about the questions about the uptake of renewable energy, particularly. My knowledge is mostly in Nunavut with a little bit in the Northwest
You should
Territories.
be up here like Craig, not me.
Well, I was back
Maybe
in the
you're
summer.
the next one, yeah.
In the summer, I gave
Yeah.
a presentation. I think some of you were here and that one.
Yeah.
But I think that in this area, you're responding to tenders and to contracts that are written up by either ISC or the GN, Government of Nunavut, or the territorial governments.
Yeah.
And invariably, these tenders are competed on a cost basis.
Yeah.
So there is very little room for you to innovate because that innovation is going to cost extra money. And so there's a very delicate balance that needs to, that the engineering firms need to follow, right?
Yes.
I mean, we can have the most elegant and beautiful renewable energy system, but we would price ourselves out of contention.
Well, that depends on whether you're weighting it in favor of capital cost or life cycle cost.
Right.
And when we did the life cycle cost of the Norman Wells Air Terminal building, they didn't respond at all. We said, this is very expensive over its life cycle. And they made no, they didn't, Transport Canada did not respond at all. And when the client does that, you just go, oh, well, as a designer, that you just go with the flow. We designed 3 arenas during an election year in the Northwest Territories: Fort McPherson, Aklavik, and Sax Harbor. And the Public Works Minister came and said, we can do these cheaper. Don't use hydronic heating, use forced air heating. So the consultants obediently followed him and put in modulating oil burners, which caused nothing but grief. The local people in Fort McPherson was a success. In Sax Harbor, the local people, in Aklavik, they cut up the heating system with a cutting torch and carried it in triumph to the dump. And then the government of the Northwest Territories turned around and sued all the consultants, even though it was the Minister of Public Works who had put the project off the rails initially. So you're absolutely right. You're very constrained by the vision and the budget of your clients.
And that's where I wanted to make the qualification too, which you've expounded on as well. And that is, if you have a leadership or council, or like a chief who is very, very technologically savvy, and either a practicing engineer or just somebody who really appreciates renewable energy, then you will see that
Yes.
in their communities. And really, it starts from that. You can't be an engineering firm from the South. Like that they're very, they don't take well for people from the South coming and telling them what to do. And so the idea needs to come from them, or at least, and then once you get traction at that level, then you will see it blossom throughout.
But us engineers, you are an engineer, I can see your ring. We're not real diplomats. We don't know how to gather all of the sheep and herd the cats and get everybody on the same page. And that's why I always defer to an architect, because they seem to be, for all their flakiness, they're past masters at achieving consensus among a large group of people. And I was going to bring the specifications for the Baffin Cultural Center, because the tender specification from the government of the Northwest Territories in 1990 is 1.5 inches thick, and it prescribes every nut and bolt in that building. And that's how detailed the tender was. And once you put all the stuff on the sea lift and send it up from Montreal by sea, and it lands on the shore in Iqaluit, it's October, and you have to have the building closed in before the winter. So it's a real scramble to get it done. And if you've got the wrong stuff on the boat, then you're in big trouble. You're not going to sign a change order that changes the structure at that stage. Thank you for your insights.
Any other questions or comments? Yeah, that one.
I don't know. Chris, this is way off topic probably, but do you talk to your brother regularly?
Oh, we talk every week on the phone. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you get into the topic of what's happening here in North America and Canada specifically, how China and the government there is reacting to what is happening between us and US.
We attempt to, but the Great Firewall of China
Ah.
has voice recognition software, and we know what topics we're allowed to talk about.
Okay.
And if we stray into things like Trump's tariffs, the line goes dead.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's not done by people, it's done by software. Yeah.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Thank
But we talk in code as a result of that. But it's very interesting what's going on there. Yeah, it's actually, I'm just agog at what he reports is going on there. And why don't we know about it here? You know, why are we not in awe and emulation of what China is doing? Why we're like Britain in the late 19th century when America developed a petroleum economy and all they could do was be jealous. You know, we're exactly the same. You know, oh, we'll stick to our Alberta way of doing things and perish it's you know it's you should. That's one area where these First Nations have it ahead of us. They're open to new ideas. They're you know, they've seen a lot over their histories. They feel at home in their own country, and they're open to new ideas. And I think that's why Wikwemekong and Manitoulin Island are so far ahead. And the very fact that Europeans aren't even interested in our culture and show up in cruise ship folds to soak up their culture is kind of a testimony to the fact that they're onto something that we were lacking. I mean, I don't mean to be a total indigenophile, if that's a word, but you know, there are things we could copy if we took note of what's going on.
I think the jealousy is a little worse down south than here.
Well, it's reached a pathological level down south, actually.
Any more questions showing up online, Doug?
No, I don't see any.
Any more questions in the room?
Just feel free to do an open discussion here. I don't
That's
have
fine.
to lead
Yeah.
it.
Well, I'm just curious, because Fortis is expanded their Tilbury LNG facility, right?
Yes, yeah.
And is there anybody taking advantage of that in BC at all or anywhere? Like in order to get off diesel and switching more to LNG or blending their fuel somewhere?
Well, it's the LNG plant itself is using LNG to compress and refrigerate the natural gas, right? You're talking about actually, rather than exporting LNG, using it.
Domestic uses, because I heard that
Well-
they were looking originally to sell it, barge it up the coast and start
Yeah.
having some of the coastal communities that are
Just
to
a minute,
start switching off diesel and
Yeah.
going into LNG.
it's a great idea, but if someone appeared at your doorstep with a barge full of LNG at 800 pounds per square inch compression at whatever it is, 200 below zero, how would you actually put it in your furnace? You know, it's a very, very highly specialized environment. But perhaps perhaps we should be doing that. Incidentally, Fortis is one of the main participants in the Wate power line. They were the ones that stepped out and said, we've been doing things all wrong. We should be involving the local communities. And they have actually taken a tremendous leadership role in that Wate power line. If you look down at the logo at the bottom, I think Fortis's logo appears on there. But the president of Fortis was addressing the the people in the communities when they were going around building consensus. And he said, we've been doing everything wrong up till now. We've been, hoarding the Ontario electricity in the southern end of the province. And we've been regulating the hell out of it. And it's time to open it up. So Fortis is actually a pretty enlightened community, pretty enlightened company. No, I'm afraid not. It's Northwestern Ontario.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when the
Fortis
Chinese
is not Fortis
tariffs,
BC.
when the Chinese tariffs come off on EVs into Canada, you can talk to Chris.
No, talk to my brother. He's
Because
marketing them.
Jonathan has a deal with 4 companies to help them bring EVs into Canada.
Well,
And I sort of instrumental in getting an electric vehicle advocacy group going national across Canada. And we have a letter coming out tomorrow that'll be sent to all the federal political parties. And one of the recommendations is to phase out those tariffs over a 4-year time period. So. Well, we'll see. Big loss if we don't get that opportunity.
Be nice if they built a plant here and built some of them here too.
Yep. Well, that'll come in time, I'm sure.
Sorry.
Go
I
ahead.
was gonna say, not quite the same sort of thing, but talking about some of the First Nations communities and such. One thing I noticed when they were, like Hydro was doing the electric high